First of all, I want to be able to listen to a little clip from the president's press conference today from the G20. So if you can, please roll cut 6.
Where you will see resistance is people being worried about a slippery slope and how effective a limited action might be. And our response, based on my discussions with our military, is that we can have a response that is limited, that is proportional, that when I say limited is both in time and in scope, but that is meaningful and that degrades Assad's capacity to deliver chemical weapons, not just this time but also in the future, and serves as a strong deterrent.
Now, I was a planner in the military at the brigade level, but I can tell you that if a commander came to me and said, Major West, I want you to develop an operation that is limited, that is proportional. I want it limited in time and scope, but I want it to be meaningful. And I want to also understand that we may have to come back and do another meaningful, limited in time and scope, but proportional response after this one. I would be totally confused. And I believe that that's what we see happening right now with our military planners. They are totally confused because they're not getting good guidance and intent from a commander. It is so important that a commander shows decisiveness. And I looked into the eyes of the president today during his press conference, and I really did not see that decisive commander that the United States of America and indeed the world will need right now. I would advise President Obama to please read The Guns of August, which is all about how the world stumbled into World War I because of miscalculations, because of not thinking about the unintended consequences. That's where we found ourselves. So today, we've got a great lineup. We're going to start off with Ambassador John Bolton, Admiral James Ace Lyons, J. Christian Adams, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Frank Gaffney, General James Conway, the 34th Commandant. Thanks so much for being on with me with the Steve Malzberg Show.
Great to be with you, Alan. Thanks very much for having me.
Now, I got to tell you, when I listened to the president today, you gave an interesting comment earlier today, I believe, on Fox News, where you talked about the juxtaposition between international norm versus international law. Can you expound upon that for us?
Yeah, you'll notice that the president and his advisors have repeatedly referred to what the Assad regime did as a violation of international norms and not international law, even though this administration, above all, would like to talk about international law. But the fact is, Syria never signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, and the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which some people cite, does not forbid the use of chemical weapons in intra-state conflicts, civil conflicts within a national border. That's not to say this is not horrible, but it's not a violation of international law. And I very much worry when you hear our president talk about international norms, which people can debate, that's to say the least, that somehow the American military is out there enforcing philosophical concepts as opposed to vital American national interests.
Now, let's also talk about something else I was doing some reading and some research on, the responsibility to protect, R2P doctrine. You know, some people want to believe that this is, adequate and it's a justification for military action. You know, this is the type of thing that the current UN Ambassador Samantha Power believes in. Can you kind of give us an understanding of this responsibility to protect doctrine and how you don't see it applying in this case?
Well, you've put your finger on a very important point, and that's exactly what the president is thinking about. This is the same doctrine he referred to in Libya, and it derives from an earlier doctrine called the duty of humanitarian intervention. And it basically means the same thing, except, the word intervention has a bad meaning. So now people don't intervene, they protect, but it amounts to exactly the same thing. I'm very familiar with that doctrine. It was first negotiated at the UN when I was there in 2005. I can tell you where the The first statement of it is found in what's called an outcome document from a summit that was held in September of 2005. And I invite people to read paragraphs 138 and 139 of the outcome document. And if they can make any sense of it, more power to them. I did my best to water it down. And I think a fair reading of those paragraphs will convince most people that I succeeded. The State Department Legal Advisor's Office said that it's not legally binding on the United States. Basically, all that it says is governments have a responsibility to protect their own people, and maybe under appropriate circumstances, the international community has that responsibility too, but only if the Security Council approves. And we can see here in the case of Syria that obviously Russia and China are never going to agree to that.
You're absolutely right. And it's interesting you brought up the case with Libya because, you know, we went into Libya with far less casualties occurring. I mean, we kept hearing about the potential for mass casualties in eastern Libya and Benghazi and what have you. So why do you think it is that we have waited so long? You know, even before the chemical weapons, you know, just bullets and artillery shells and airstrikes, you know, everyone is saying you have upwards to 100,000 casualties. So why do you think we have waited to this point to really get involved when we had a window of opportunity to maybe make a difference in Syria a lot earlier?
Yeah, well, I think you put your finger on another important point. I think it reflects the incoherence of the president's policy. And I think it also reflects the hole that he has dug himself into, beginning with his statement about the red lines on the use of chemical weapons during the height of the 2012 presidential
But that's not his
campaign.
red line now, Ambassador.
Oh, that's right. Oh, I forgot. He's never responsible for anything. But whoever drew it, you know, we had substantial evidence the Assad regime had crossed that red line in March of this year, and he didn't do anything then. So that's why I think it was a political problem he had created for himself, and he realized that his rhetoric had been exposed for the hollow structure that it really is. And then when he found that he couldn't get a Security Council authorization, he couldn't get the Arab League to endorse it, he couldn't get NATO to endorse it, he realized that his political problem was even deeper than it is. And it just goes back to my fundamental point. If there are vital American interests at stake, then I think we have to consider the use of military force, and I think Congress would approve it. But here, there are no vital American interests at stake. There's a political problem for the president, and I don't think Congress should pull him out of it.
You know, it's interesting you say that. I want to play a cut from the G20 today. If you could roll cut 7, please.
I did not put this before Congress. Just as a political ploy or as symbolism. I put it before Congress because I could not honestly claim that the threat posed by Assad's use of chemical weapons on innocent civilians and women and children posed a imminent direct threat to the United States. In that situation, obviously, I don't worry about Congress. We do what we have to do to keep the American people safe. I could not say that it was immediately, directly going to have an impact on our allies. Again, in those situations, I would act right away. This wasn't even a situation like Libya, where you've got troops rolling towards Benghazi, and you have a concern about time in terms of saving somebody right away. This was an event that happened. My military assured me that we could act today, tomorrow, a month from now, that we could do so proportionally, but meaningfully. And in that situation, I think it is important for us to have a serious debate in the United States.
Ambassador, there is no doubt that the president has, drawn himself into a very, very tight box. And most believe, I've heard numbers of up to 300 members of the House will be voting no. What options do you believe the president has if Congress comes back, the House definitely, and says they vote no, and the House is the representatives of the people? They're the voice of the people.
Yeah, well, I think the president has constitutional authority here under the Commander-in-Chief clause to direct the U.S. military to go after targets in Syria. I think he may doubt that he has it, and I think he's very worried about the politics of it. But his own argument, as you just played it, it doesn't make any sense. He had no way of knowing that having launched one chemical weapons attack, Assad was not going to launch another one. So the Libya argument seems to, in his mind, not my mind, but the Libya argument here about the responsibility to protect should have motivated him to use force without what could well be, at best, a month's delay before he's able to do something. And I think it is another piece of evidence of the confusion of his strategy, if you can call it that, to deal with Syria. And it mistakes what the real point is. The real point, the real problem is Iran.
You know, when we look at the true head, the true nexus of all this being Iran, strategically, and as I get ready to wrap up the interview, strategically, should we be focused on Iran rather than be focused, on the smaller ball, which is this incident in Syria? Because if you do something in Syria, you're going to have to contend with Iran in the later stage anyhow.
Yeah, no, look, this is, for us, it's getting lost in a strategic sideshow. It's a tragedy in Syria, but the Assad regime would have fallen 2 years ago if the Iranians weren't in there giving it protection. And that's why I think that we should focus on where the real threat to international peace and security is and not get bogged down in a civil war.
Well, I will go back again and I will say what I've said before. The president, I believe, strategically made a foolhardy choice to make a campaign promise to zero out our troop force presence in Iraq. We could have maintained some type of residual force, which is what the generals on the ground recommended, and we could have positioned them out there along the border with Iraq and Syria, on the border with Iraq and Iran, and we could have positioned them up there with the Kurdish forces, the Kurdish people, because I see that as a real threat also to the Kurds as well. So, Ambassador, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and I always look forward to your commentary.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Look forward to doing it again.
Thanks so much. Ladies and gentlemen, that was former UN Ambassador John Bolton. 1-855-777-9660. We're ready to take your calls. We're going to have a 4-minute break, and when we come back, I'd like to hear from you on this situation in Syria and what are the concerns of the American people. This is Alan West, guest host in the Steve Malzberg Show. We'll be back right after this break.